by just asking you to share a little bit around your own background, your own story, and how you really got interested in culture, high performance, and mindset.
Great. Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for the invitation, Andy, to come along, and thank you for those of you that are kind enough to tune in this evening and listen. It's great to meet you. In terms of my background, it's I've got an eclectic background. Is probably a kind way of describing it, Andy. That I grew up in Manchester, in the north of the city, but my playground was a boxing gym. So long before I was born, my dad had established a boxing gym in the city, and like most boxing gyms, they tend to be based in inner city areas where there tends to be a lot of social deprivation around them, and that was certainly the case of where I grew up. But there was two strands to that background. That when I went down the route of academia, one of the phrases that is often bandied around in that world is that we don't do research, we tend to do me-search, where we try and understand our own background and our own biography. And through doing that, I recognised that I'd been exposed to high performance from as long as I can remember. So there was guys that were members of that boxing club that went on to win Olympic medals. There was guys there that went on to become world boxing champions. So I was exposed very much to that world of elite performance and what it took to do that, as well as the coaching that happened in the shadows and the sheer effort and work that went in behind it. But the second and probably most tangible thing around it was the power of culture. Because whilst the club was badged as a boxing club, I'd estimate that about 90% of the members from that club never set foot into a boxing ring. And that wasn't the purpose of it. It was often a sanctuary from some quite difficult personal situations that people were battling with, where they could go into an environment and know that they were safe, they would be respected, and there was a sense of belonging that was very evident within it. And there was a whole heap of different factors that I've subsequently come to understand are all elements of high-performing cultures. For example, having non-negotiable behaviours within that environment. So a really simple example is that bad language wasn't permitted within the club. And that wasn't because it was seen as some kind of moral crusade. It was just that bad language was seen as indicative of a lack of discipline. And if you lack discipline to hold your tongue and not use bad language, you would lack discipline in other areas of your life that could have far greater consequences. So things like those non-negotiables were being instilled at a really, really young age for everybody that came within it. Now, a nice sort of end to that story, to bring it full circle, if you like, was that a couple of years ago, Manchester Council named a road in honour of my father in tribute to the impact and the legacy of the work that he'd done. I mean, I'm fortunate my dad is still with us, but unfortunately, he's quite seriously ill these days with advanced dementia. But what I would say is that 90% of the people, there was about 300 people that turned up on a really cold, bitter January afternoon to pay tribute to this unveiling. And again, I'd estimate about 90% of the people that showed up there that day had never boxed in their life. But what they wanted to come and do was pay tribute to a person and an environment that had shaped them as people, as parents, as partners, and as professionals in a wider life. And those two elements of high performance and the power of culture to shape and create high performance were there from as long as I can remember, and have subsequently influenced my own career and the choices that I've made. So now what I tend to do is work with leaders, whether this is in education, whether it's in elite sport, or whether it's in the corporate world, that are interested in using culture as a competitive advantage, and help them to understand how they can do that and what the composite parts of it are.
I mean, I'm going to come back to culture and really talk about that commitment culture in a minute. But one of the things that I'd just like to explore first is, I think it was Clive Woodward who says, success doesn't come in straight lines. And I remember watching one of your videos and you had that Carol Dweck drawing where, you've got the lines going all over the place. Instead of this straight line of success from start to finish, it's up, it's down, it's round, it's backwards, it's forwards. And I'm really interested in, coming from North Manchester to where you've managed to get yourself today, you've clearly had to face some significant setbacks or disappointments or challenges. How does Damian Hughes handle disappointments, setbacks, to ensure overall he does keep moving in that direction.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, and you're absolutely right. The messy middle of change, as Brené Brown refers to it, or Carol Ross Cantor refers to it as Cantor's law, that bit in the middle where it looks and feels like a failure. Nobody's immune to that, and I'm certainly not been the case. I mean, so my experience has been, there's a couple of things that have been really quite significant. One is I've spent a long time identifying my own non-negotiable behaviors. These are almost like my trademarks that I won't compromise on. And the way I evidenced it on these was asking myself a question of, when do I feel I've been at my best? When do I feel I've been fulfilled or satisfied or performing close to my potential? And rather than taking those occasions for granted or just attributing it to external factors of, say, like the people around me or luck or the projects I was working on, I've done an analysis to say, well, what was it in me? How did I show up and behave that was consistently present? And what I found out that there's three almost like internal gatekeepers that I use now before I take on a project. So the first one is kindness, coming from a place of kindness. And I know that can sound quite an abstract or esoteric phrase to use, but it comes from a place of saying, if you start by treating yourself kindly, you then have the capacity to be empathetic and treat others kindly as well. So I noticed that when that is a behavior that's been absent, I've tended to suffer for it. So I've driven myself to a couple of occasions where I've got myself quite seriously ill. And that's often been a case of ignoring that kindness and keep driving relentlessly and almost obsessively towards a target. So kindness has to be there these days. The second non-negotiable behavior is having fun, because I think if you look at any time that you're engaged and you immerse yourself in it, there's got to be something that attracts you, that delights you, that enthralls you and thrills you. So having fun is a really important characteristic, whether that's the excitement of working with an individual like yourself on these calls, Andy, or the project itself excites me, but having fun is non-negotiable these days as well. And then the third and final one is I have to feel that I can make a positive contribution to the project or the situation that I'm in. So this was a saying that my dad used to say to me as I was a kid. He said, if your absence isn't noticed, your difference isn't significant enough. So it's the idea of you have to bring something that you can offer that would make a positive difference. And what I found is, like I say, that when I've hit those occasions where things have gone wrong or I've hit difficult times, inevitably, there've been early warning signals beforehand that I've ignored one of those three trademark behaviors and found an excuse to mitigate or decide not to do it. So I think that's a really important factor. And I think when things have gone wrong, that phrase that you said earlier about fault versus responsibility is another really significant factor. I very quickly moved from whose fault it is to look at, well, how can I be responsible? What can I do around this to make the situation better? I think they're two important factors for me that have been significant when I've hit my own difficult periods.
And as you know, in my opinion, you also have this incredible humility, which I admire, enormously. One of the other things, by the way, that I picked up from the High Performance podcast, which is constantly in my mind at the minute, was when you and Jake were talking and you kind of flipped it around from how clever are you to how are you clever? And I now started to think about that in some of the work I do with my clients. Instead of how talented are you, how are you talented? And I think that's just a beautiful way of flipping it.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I mean, that question comes from one of my academic heroes is a guy called Howard Gardner, who is an educational psychologist. And he was intrigued by the question that he said, if you went and saw like an Aboriginal tribesman out in the bush and you went and met a Wall Street banker, both of them would be incredibly talented and gifted within their own worlds. But if you were to swap them over and change positions, where would that innate intelligence go? And that was the question that he had, that said that we often limit ourselves by, if you think of education, so he argues for multiple intelligences. We're all gifted, but gifted in different ways. So some of us might be verbally gifted, some might be socially gifted, some might be musically gifted, some of us might be physically gifted. But if we only ever categorize intelligence through the lens of how well you score on a grade exam for maths or English, how many children leave school thinking they're stupid, when the reality is we haven't found their natural intelligence and played to it. So, this is a world where Paul McCartney at school wasn't picked for his school choir. Nobody knew that he played an instrument, and I think there's so many people that we've been fortunate enough to interview on the podcast that you wouldn't categorize that if they probably did a SATs exam or an IQ score, probably wouldn't score that highly on it. And yet they obviously are incredibly intelligent. And I think it's a question that really intrigues me with our guests of how are you clever, not how clever are you? And like you say, it can be a game changer for any of us that when we're dealing with, one of my other heroes is a guy called Cus D'Amato that was Mike Tyson's trainer. He was like an old wizened guru that lived up in the Catskill Mountains. And he had another great phrase that he said, there are no stupid people, just uninterested ones. And I think if you start from that premise of we need to find out what's your area of intelligence and then how do we interest and engage you with that, we find that most people can flourish or blossom.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely brilliant. And I look at my oldest daughter, she's 23 and not that academic, but has built a global business in 18 months through Instagram and has gone way beyond, I had a pretty successful corporate career in the UK and Australia and has gone way beyond at 23. And again, if she was classified purely by that, how clever are you? She wouldn't have scored particularly well, but put her in a completely different environment and she's just flourished. So I think it's a really powerful way of looking at teams as well, where sometimes teams can be too one-dimensional.
Absolutely. I think that's a really powerful point you make, Andy, that I think that this is why when I work with leaders that are looking to use culture and harness it as a competitive advantage, one of the big things that I often say to them is ambiguity is your biggest enemy. Ambiguity is the enemy. Unless you clarify the behavioral rules of the game that you want within your culture that are going to allow people to flourish, you create ambiguity because then it becomes subjective, where people are unsure what's acceptable here. So taking time at the start to communicate, these are the rules of the game that you're playing with. And there was a really beautiful way of, in one of the interviews I did with an Argentine coach called Mauricio Pochettino, that's been incredibly successful in the English Premier League, but in the Spanish league before that. He was really clear about that he had 3 non-negotiable behaviors for every club that he sets out. So the first one is you have to bring positive energy. The second behavior is you have to have a can-do attitude. Whatever gets thrown at you, you've got to assimilate it and just say, let's make the best of it. And then the third one is you put the team above any individual. Now, he's really clear that they're his 3 non-negotiables that have served him well. And the beautiful way he articulated it was, he said, I tell people up front that that's what I expect. He said, and for some people, that's not right for them, that those 3 behaviors are not going to allow them to flourish and give their best. But if we can understand that at the start of our relationship, we can walk away and you can go to a different environment. We can find a different environment where you can flourish as well. But we don't need to come into conflict or create enmity. And his argument is that if we can articulate that as early as possible, that removes ambiguity and allows people to decide, am I going to be a part of this? Which then leads us to that phrase that you used earlier. If in any high-performing culture, nobody sleepwalks into it. You don't find yourself in a high-performing team by accident. At some stage during the process, you make a very clear decision or a commitment that you want to be a part of it and you understand what's expected and you sign up and commit that you'll do that. And that's what we understand is the highest performing culture isn't a good culture, isn't a great culture. The correct technical term for it is a commitment culture. And a commitment culture has got 2 things, a clear purpose, this is why we exist. And again, going back, a clear set of behaviours that people are signing up to and committing to be assessed by.
And one of the things I'd love to explore is, you talk about the 5 cultures, one of which is the commitment culture. And also you make that really powerful distinction between a value and a team behavior. So how the value is demonstrated through the behaviors exhibited within the organization. So yeah, I'd love to open that out to the 5 different cultures.
Sure. Okay. Well, this is research that was done. So back in the early 1990s, there was 2 guys called Barron and Hannon at Stanford University, the organizational psychologists, and they used to lecture that culture could be a competitive advantage. And their students used to go, yeah, I agree with that. Where's the proof? And there was none. So they set out on what was intended to be a 2-year project. It ended up lasting 20 years and is the most comprehensive review on this topic. And they went into Silicon Valley, given the close proximity of it to Stanford, where they went and studied startup businesses and looked at what types of cultures emerge. And what they found is traditionally there'll be 5 different types that will emerge in any organization. So the first one is what we call a star culture. And a star culture is think of somewhere like Google, where they go out of their way to recruit the most talented people they can, pay them the highest salaries, give them the best facilities, and you almost sit back and wait for all that talent in the room to come together and deliver extraordinary results. And on occasion, it works, like Google will attest. But what it blinds us to is far more frequently, it'll go wrong. And when it goes wrong, the fallout from it will be huge as well. So in football terms, I interviewed a guy called Diego Lopez that had been a coach at Real Madrid when they had this star culture in place there. And he gave me what I thought was a really apposite quote. He said, in a star culture, everyone wants to be the head waiter, but nobody wants to wash the dishes. And it's often the back of house stuff that'll derail you. The second type of culture you'll get is an autocracy. And this is where it's about might be a founding father, it might be a charismatic chief exec. In football, it might be a head coach, but it's where it tends to be down to the whims of one person, and it's my way or the highway, which again can be successful as long as the leader doesn't go rogue or doesn't start making flawed judgments. The third culture you get is a bureaucratic culture, and this is a culture where very quickly you get a thick layer of middle managers and everything gets decided by rules and regulations and policies and procedures, and it's almost like decisions are made via committee and consensus. Now, again, the flaw with that is it can work, but it's slow and it's ponderous. To get anything through becomes difficult. The fourth type of culture you get is an engineering culture, which, contrary to the name, isn't about engineering skills, but it is about technical ability. So you recruit people that have got a deep knowledge in a narrow domain. Now, again, the flaw with that is that what you get there is lots of fiefdoms and internal politics that quickly emerge. But the fifth type of culture is what we've just described earlier, which is a commitment culture. And what the evidence says is commitment cultures that have a really clear purpose and a really clear set of behaviours always outperform the others by, on average, about 22%. So if you look at it in terms of market share, profitability, speed to market, employee turnover, pretty much every big metric that a business would measure its success against, commitment cultures over a sustained period will outperform them. So this is one of the first things that I'd encourage anyone listening tonight to do is get away from using subjective, pejorative terms. Oh, that's a good culture, that's a bad culture, or that's a toxic culture, that's a high-performing culture. Get away from that and instead start referring to it as what type of culture is it? Because you'll often find that decisions that are being made might be being made through the lens of an autocratic leader, which will contradict the commitment model. So you start to see how, and then that creates ambiguity. So that's the first thing. But to go on to the second question, which is, you'll notice that I keep making a distinction here between trademark behaviors as opposed to values. And the reason I do that is because values are a great starting point, but they shouldn't be the end point for this conversation. Because a value is deep, it's personal, and it's intrinsic. So I might hold a value that you know nothing about. And we could know each other years and you wouldn't know that I held that value because it's personal to me. But a behavior is an extension of that. My behaviors should be a representation of my values in action. And a value should be, a value, if it goes through to the behavioral form, is visible and you should be able to tell it. So the example that I sometimes offer just to illustrate this is that when I was doing the research on this initially, I met a chief exec of a business that was at pains to tell me that he had a meritocracy. And when I said, what does that mean? He said, everybody's equal. It doesn't matter your rate, your rank, your status, your experience. If you've got an idea, it'll be shared and respected as well as anybody else. And my challenge to him was, that sounds like ideal, but why do you have reserved car parking spaces for the senior leadership team? Because I don't need to walk any further than your reception area to see a huge contradiction between what you say is a value and yet how you behave in practice. Now, his challenge to me was, do you think that's a significant matter? I said, I estimate 80% of the time, nobody will care. But there'll be 20% of your leadership where you hit that messy middle, those difficult moments we spoke about. And in those occasions, when you tell people, I need you to trust me, that's where the car parking spot will become a cultural albatross, because you've contradicted yourself, you've undermined that trust. And people will point to your car parking policy and maybe be a little bit reserved in terms of wanting to follow you, because at the very basic, intuitive, primitive level, we don't follow hypocrites.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely. I mean, I've been obsessing about that since we spoke on the Tuesday night. I think it was my time, and one of the exercises I do with all my clients is we do this thing called a team shield, where we talk about why we're a team, what's the team purpose, but then we deliberately talk about team behaviours as opposed to organisational values. And you've really prompted me to think, absolutely need to revisit that and just go that little bit deeper and look for those cultural albatrosses that actually were. So
I'll give you an example that you might be able to use. That when I work with sports teams, this is a common one that I use. That when we start on this process of identifying trademark behaviours, one of the ones that I'll ask them, I'll say, give me some of the behaviours that you wouldn't be true in our culture. And one of the ones that you can do this with any of them, but I'll give you an example. They'll shout out trust, and I'll go, right, let's take trust then. How important is trust? And they all go, yeah, it's critical. And you say, right, give it a number then. Out of importance, if 1 is irrelevant, 10 is critical, how important is trust? And they all go 10, or 9 or 10. So you go, right, okay. Say, right, so we've established then this is your behaviour and you think it's critical. Say, we'll do a quick test. Say, have a look around the room. So they all have a look around. I say, I want you to identify who is the person in this room that you trust less than anyone else. And I say, and now I'm going to give you 2 minutes to walk over to that person, look them in the eye, and in an adult, mature, discreet manner, I want you to give them feedback on why you don't trust them as much as other people and how they can behave to establish trust. Now, I don't care how big and how tough and how hard a lot of these guys that you ask that question to, as soon as you set that task, they all suddenly take a real interest in the weave of the carpet or something on the bottom of their shoe. Now, my answer to them is, I didn't tell you that trust was 10 out of 10, you did. And I didn't tell you trust had to be a behaviour, you did. So all I've done is say, now let's look at it, let's take it from the realms of a value to a behaviour. And what I would say to them is, that doesn't exist at this moment in time. At the moment, you might have it as an aspiration to be 10, but you're currently existing somewhere on a 2 or 3 on the scale. Now, if we're serious about making this part of our culture, we need to move us along that axis where those kind of conversations are happening by definition rather than by accident.
Yeah, wow, that's pretty powerful. There's 1 or 2 of my organisational clients on this call, so get ready for some exercises like that. I'd love to take you back, Damian. One of the things you said was about people you can't sleepwalk into a commitment-based culture. But one of the other things, I was reviewing the 5 steps to a winning mindset, and you talk about simplifying and thinking and emotional intelligence and practicality and storytelling, which I think are 5 incredibly powerful elements. When you were talking about thinking, you were saying that, frequently people will spend 95% of their life on autopilot.
Yeah.
So how can you help us almost reduce that so we spend more time, really engaged with our purpose and our potential and moving our life in the direction of where we're capable of taking it?
It's a brilliant question, Andy. And I think the first thing is that we do spend an awful lot of time on autopilot, and that's absolutely fine. So in psychology, we refer to it as heuristics, like mental models that we adopt and assimilate very early on that work for us. So you think about when you walk into a room and you flick a light switch, you don't stop and gasp at the wonder of electricity every time that light turns on, because that's just the way it is. So that's a heuristic or a mental model that you say, you don't need to go back and revise it. So the vast majority of what we do works for us. The challenge is when it doesn't work. And this is where we need to have the ability to learn and unlearn. So if you're listening to this now, ask yourself, when was the last time you genuinely changed your mind on something? Because the reality is, we get to a sort of level of our development and we sort of just stop thinking about it. We think that we know the answers, and then we very rarely go back and change our mind on it. So I often use the example of in businesses that I see lots of people that, like, when you go abroad on holiday to somewhere where the language you speak isn't the first language, and you see, say, a typical Brit abroad going on a holiday and the barman doesn't understand what drink they're trying to order. How does the typical Brit abroad deal with that communication difficulty?
Right.
Well, tell louder and speak slower. Now, when you're observing them, do they become more coherent or more obnoxious in the process? And the answer is, well, of course, they're not any more intelligible. They're just more of a pain in the arse. And I see that so often in organizations. When I hear people say, oh, we need a bigger budget, we need more resources, I need more money to throw at this. To me, it's the equivalent of the guy shouting at somebody in a foreign language. Because what you're doing is you're not thinking about, how do I approach this in a different way? You're saying, how do I do more of the same stuff that I know works every time? And this is where it can become a problem, where people get stuck in certain models that the way it used to be. So therefore, that's why it's important to understand that you don't need to change it all the time, but you do need to know how to go back and think at regular occasions. So there's lots of different ways to do it, but some of the techniques I talk about are, first of all, you need to almost set tripwires for yourself. So you need to have the ability to recognize when you're banging your head against the wall and give yourself a pause for reflection. So it might be, say, with a client that, I'll give you an example. I was doing some work with a guy a few years ago that was going through a difficult separation from his wife. And every time that they spoke on the phone, things got quite toxic quite quickly. And it was causing subsequent issues in his professional life, which is why we ended up speaking about it. So I said to him, where does this conversation take place most of the time that causes you such anxiety? He said, it's on the phone. So I said, so how do we build the tripwire on the phone? So he said, what do you mean? I said, well, how do you want to speak? So let's start with your trademark behaviors. When you're speaking to your ex-partner, how would you like to come across? How would you describe the behaviors? And he had 3. He said, I want to be calm, I want to be polite, but I want to be confident. I said, right, fine. I said, so where does the conversation take place? He said, on my phone. So I said, right, there's your tripwire moment. I said, so when your wife's number comes up on the phone, what's your reaction? And he said, well, when I see her number, my initial reaction is to go, oh God, because I know I'm steeling myself for a fight. So I said, well, let's break a tripwire at that moment, because that's an automatic response. So what we did was, it took us less than a minute. When his wife's name came up on the phone, we just wrote the words calm, polite, confident underneath his wife's name. So when he saw that phone ringing and he looked at it, not only did he see his wife's name, he had a tripwire moment that said, these are the 3 behaviors you need to show up with. Mm-hmm. Now, what it led him to do was, on some occasions, he didn't answer the phone at that moment. He would look at it and go, I don't feel capable of being calm, polite, and confident. So instead, he would send an SMS message that said, I'll phone you back in 20 minutes. On other occasions, he learned to go into a different room where he could project himself. On some occasions, he could calm himself down before he answered the phone. But by focusing on those tripwire moments, he broke that pattern of behavior that was causing him pain. But it took him a while to recognize that he was the equivalent of shouting at foreigners in a foreign language, that he was causing himself pain because he was stuck in those patterns. And that was where a tripwire can break those heuristics and force us to stop and think. So that's just one way. Another way is just get out of the echo chamber that we live in. So I got, over the last 12 months, I've removed myself from so much of social media, because social media is an echo chamber in many ways. I'd encourage anyone listening to this, read John Haight's book called The Coddling of the American Mind, because he talks about social media does 3 things to us. The first thing it does is it divides us up into binary camps, good versus evil, right versus wrong. So there's no nuance or subtlety in the middle. The second thing is we mistake feelings for facts. So when you're upset about something, you interpret it that that's a fact. And then the third thing is that you're surrounded almost by an echo chamber of your own opinions just being repeated back to you. So it removes from us that flexibility of thought, that ability to see things from different angles. So I'm advocating removing from social media, but that's not a prescription. It's more just an idea that says you don't need to remove yourself from it, as long as you feel that you're getting a wide variety of opinions and stimulus that force you to look at things from different perspectives.
Yeah, I'd say there's a couple of things in that. I mean, certainly as soon as the world started to become more turbulent this year, I absolutely limited the amount of news. I absolutely limited the amount of time I would spend on social media. I also built my own, what I call a circuit breaker. So, I'll use this, it's a 60-second circuit breaker, either before a big meeting with a client or particularly after a disappointment, because as you know, and I know, when you're self-employed, it's back to that fault versus responsibility. I can't spend any time feeling sorry for myself because I'm not pushing my life and business forward. So I have a very, very quick 60 seconds where I rewrite my primary goal, I rewrite my chosen affirmation, I rewrite 2 or 3 things I'm happy and grateful for, and I rewrite something I'm proud of that I've achieved in my life, big or small. And it is like a tripwire. You also talk about the example where the white line on the side of the pitch, where once you go across that white line, it's a trip wire to almost get into the high performance zone. Now, I'm very conscious, Damian, I could sit and talk to you for hours, but I'm very conscious that you've got your next appointment coming up. And I do want to open up just for a few minutes, a few questions from our members. So if anyone, feel free to either put a question in the chat or take yourself off mute. We've got exactly the same people as for the first call. I know some of them is different, which is really, really interesting. So there's quite a big group, but please do take yourself off mute or put a question in the chat. Let's make the most of the opportunity we have with Damian whilst he's here.
I'll tell you, just as an aside, with the interview we're doing next is with Fascinating. It comes out on Monday, but we're doing it later on this evening with the actor Matthew McConaughey. So if you tune to the podcast, listen to it. That I think it promises to be fairly fascinating.
Can I tell you a really amazing thing? First of all, if you haven't listened to the episode with Marcelino Sande, the principal dancer of the Royal Ballet, it's one of my absolute favourites, and I know nothing about classical ballet. I know nothing about ballet full stop. So whatever you're interested in life, I find these podcasts absolutely fascinating. But you told me that about Matthew McConaughey, and I was doing a sleep meditation last night because I'd done a full-on webinar delivery for a UK business, so it was late in the evening, and I was trying to switch off my brain so I could get some really restful sleep before this morning. And I just went on to the Calm app, which is my chosen meditation app, and up popped, there's an area within it called the Spark, and where a guy interviews for about 10-15 minutes different people from different industries around the world, and it was Matthew McConaughey. And I was like, wow, Damian says I'm going to be interviewing Matthew, and then here he is popping up on my meditation app. So I don't know if it's the law of attraction or the way the universe works, but it was absolutely incredible. We have a question from Ian Wade over in Birmingham.
Hi, Damian. Fantastic presentation as always. Thank you very much. I guess this question comes to mind, obviously, the sad death of Maradona today. It's George Best's anniversary. How do you incorporate that sort of flawed genius into a commitment culture, or is that something that's not possible under that model?
Wow, it's a brilliant question. I'll tell you that, this sounds like a big name drop, but it's not intended to. But I referenced him earlier. We interviewed Pochettino, who, when he was an 18-year-old boy, was a roommate of Maradona's, and that was a question I asked him. I said, "What did you learn from? You're 18 years old, and you're with at this stage he was a veteran," and the way he spoke about Maradona was very different than the perception of him. He said he was humble. He said he was kind. And the third thing was, he said he put the team above his own self-interest every time. So I think there's a combination there with some of these guys that I think, while there are superstars, the real superstars are the ones that sacrifice themselves for the team ethic as well, the ones that sustain success like he did. But in terms of how do you incorporate them? I think that's where it comes back to the behaviours, Ian. I think it comes back to, you have to be really clear of your non-negotiable behaviors. And then another area then that becomes really powerful is, I talk about this phrase, cultural architects within a team. Now, there are always alphas within a team. There are always leaders. We put any group of people together, leaders emerge. It's part of our primitive DNA. But a cultural architect is one of these leaders. Now, traditionally, an architect will emerge on two criteria, social or technical. So they're either the best players or they're larger than life gregarious characters. Now, if you can marry these leaders up with the behaviors and ask them to role model what you're asking everyone else to do, the behaviors go into the blood supply of your culture so much quicker. Because if you see your best player showing humility, if that's one of your behaviors, or your best players staying behind and working harder than anybody else, the impact that has on the rest of the culture is people will follow them. So, like, I'll use a personal example from Manchester United. The role of Eric Cantona at Manchester United was huge. Not because there was a great story that that a couple of people have told me about him, that one of the trademark behaviours at Manchester United was you had to have the courage, and they talk about courage to take a risk, to do something different. And there was a nice story that when Cantona, the players once had this whip round. They had they'd recorded a video and they all got royalties on this video. And when they divided it up amongst the squad, I think it came to about everyone got £300 each. So the players got together and said, I'll tell you what we'll do, we'll throw it all in a pot and we'll just draw one name out of the hat. So one person will get 16 grand as opposed to everyone getting 300 quid. But they said to the young players, you don't have to go in for this because £300 is significant for you. And out of the 5 young players in the squad, 3 of them said, okay, thank you, and took the money. But 2 of the younger players, Paul Scholes and Nicky Butt, said, no, put our name in the hat. We want the chance to win it. And when they drew it out, the winner of the £16,000 was Eric Cantona. And everyone went, oh, you lucky so-and-so. The next day, Cantona came in with 2 cheques for £8,000 each and gave them to the youngest members of the squad, Scholes and Butt. And when he gave it to them, he said, that's because you dared to take a risk to win. That's your reward for doing it. Now, I've had that conversation recounted to me by people that were there 20, 25 years later after he did it. So you imagine how profound the impact of that is in the moment of the message of, in this organization, you have the courage to take a risk, to dare to win big rather than play small and aim to win small.
Massive lesson for all of us in business about that as well. We've got a question from Andrew Roach, which is around self-belief versus ability. So, Andrew, I don't know if you just want to take yourself off mute, and then we may have time for one more question after this.
No, that's fine.
Far away.
Can you hear me okay?
We certainly can.
All right, good stuff. Damian, I've listened to your podcasts with Jake with interest, and I guess I've learned a lot and been fascinated by this balance between self-belief and ability. And what's emerged a lot is the dominance of self-belief in many cases with the high performers. And I've been in leadership roles for over 20 years, and I've run loads of sessions to develop people's ability. What are some of the ways that you think leaders could approach developing people's self-belief if that's more of a dominant feature of high performers?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for listening, Andrew. I appreciate you sort of giving up your time to do that. At the very heart of developing self-belief, there's a simple sentence that you can use. Confidence comes from evidence. All confidence, the foundation of it is built on evidence. For you to be confident of doing something, you have to have some degree of evidence that you're capable of doing that. And that's where there's a really simple exercise that you can do this culturally or individually, is success leaves clues. Just get people to identify when you've been good, why have you been good? And get them to start understanding what are the characteristics that you personally bring to any occasion where success is evident. So to give you a really simple way of explaining it, that if you ever watch like football or whatever sport you watch, listen to the coaches in the interview after a defeat, because it's fascinating. Because what average coaches will do is they externalize the defeat. They say, oh, the referee was no good, the opposition did this, the conditions today weren't conducive. What high performing coaches will do is they'll internalize it and they'll identify behaviours that weren't present. They'll say, you know what, our intensity wasn't as good as it could have been today, or our passing could have been sharper. They will have a reason that is all controllable, but is based on the evidence that they know that they can do it. So I think when you have evidence that leads to confidence, what you're doing is you're saying to people, do you remember when you did that, as opposed to, wouldn't it be great if you could do that? And the more evidence you can accumulate, it's almost like a scaffolding. You can then scaffold confidence on top of it, that you might be in a different domain or you might be in a different context, but you've got evidence that you've been able to adapt to change, you've been able to cope with meeting new people, whatever it is, that gives you just that quiet hum of self-confidence to be able to face whatever the conditions are. And you get almost that, you almost get that consistency then in terms of your approach.
Fantastic, great question, and fantastic answer as well. And to be honest, I'm a very simple guy, Andrew, and Andrew lives just up the road now on the Gold Coast here as well. Although you can spot the Manchester accent. I surround myself with visual images of visual representations of where I'm going, but also visual representations of where I've been, which actually is reminding myself it's the clues that have taken me from where I was to where I am to where I'm going to go. And all of these things, I think, have a really powerful impact on my subconscious mind and my level of self-belief and confidence. I'm a great believer that ability only gets you into the game, and it's all these other factors that enable you to then win the game. So we've got time for one more question, and then we must let Damian hook up with Jake and go and meet Matt. So who's got a final question? Helen, up in Brisbane, Australia.
Thanks, Andy. Damian, I found your talk very interesting. I've been writing notes as you've been talking. I'll just take you back to the non-negotiable behaviours. I thought that was very good, that looking at changing behaviours rather than blaming what went wrong, who went wrong, or whatever. I've written down, having fun, make a positive difference. What was the first one of the non-negotiable behaviours?
My personal one was kindness, Helen.
Oh, right. I did write down kindness, actually. I got the word, and then I wasn't sure if I'd actually heard you right. So, yeah.
Yeah, no. It often, I'm not saying it surprised you, but I think the amount of places that I'll go into sort of like quite macho alpha male environments, and I'm a real advocate that if you're not observing kindness, even in those environments, either try and change it or change your environment. So just as an aside, I mean, I often say this, like when I go into sports teams, that I'll hear people excusing behaviour as one of my most hated words, which is banter. One of my, when people excuse behaviour as banter, that to me is often the last refuge of the dickhead. It's often nasty, it's snide, it's unpleasant, and then when you call somebody out on it and say, I don't appreciate that, they'll go, it's just banter, mate, it's just having a laugh. And I draw a distinction. I say, humour is inclusive. Banter relies on excluding somebody from the joke. And therefore, you turn a blind eye to that kind of conduct and that kind of behaviour. Not only does it lack kindness, but then you start to create divisions and cliques. And whilst it might an aside, and you go, is it really that significant? You go, well, I believe it is, because when you come under pressure, you don't rise to the level, you descend to where you spend most of your time. And if you've allowed those cliques and divisions to creep in.
Yeah, I agree. I think like you've certainly given us something else to look at and think about there, because we are often find ourselves in situations where things have gone wrong or not gone quite right, to what we envisaged in the beginning. So you can't dwell on what went wrong forever and a day. You've got to move forward, and what you've suggested, I think, is a good way to start the process of moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give you an example. I got in trouble earlier this year. I had somebody threatened to sue me because I hadn't attributed a quote from them in a book, and the stakes of what I was being threatened with were quite significant sums of money. So in the end, I had to take a decision just to almost jump through the hoops that was required, because I couldn't afford to face the legal action. And it was bruising, it was horrible, it was chastening in so many different ways. And again, I think coming back to that idea of being kind to myself was really powerful. It wasn't a mistake that was made out of malice. It was a genuine, legitimate mistake. But I think you can beat yourself up for it, or you can hold your hands up and then accept that life throws these curveballs at all of us.
So I think there's a couple of things for me, Helen. Go and listen to the High Performance podcast with Sean Wayne, the England Rugby League coach, ex-Wigan Warriors, which is a fantastic example of genuine care, kindness in obviously the world of professional rugby league, which is, as we know, being Queenslanders, is a very, very tough environment. I think it's a phenomenal interview. The second thing that really struck me when I first listened to Damian talking about kindness is that kindness starts with yourself. Be kind to yourself, and then build that into the way that you absolutely live your life around others. But as Damian just explained there, it starts with us. And the third thing is that bounce back ability, which Royston Guest was talking about, that ability to bounce back at speed. And I think it is those non-negotiable behaviours that enable you to do that. So Damian, I think we need to allow you a few minutes just to reset and refocus and re-energize before your next meeting. I want to say I cannot thank you enough. I've learned absolutely heaps. And I said at the end of the first call, and I'll say it again now, that I think I'm pretty good at what I do, but I can see the crescent, and I believe Damian can see the whole of the moon. And I'm sure there's a lot of people who know their 80s music, who know where that quote will come from. So Damian, any final words for yourself, and then we'll let you get on your way.
Well, I mean, the final words from me, Andy, are a huge thank you for inviting me on to come and chat with you, and thank you to those of you that have tuned in to listen. I know time is precious. I know that we're all under huge constraints and demands. So if you've given up your time to listen to this, I'm hugely humbled and grateful for doing it. So thank you very much, and I wish you the very best of luck.
Brilliant. I look forward to the next time. Cheers, mate. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Keep winning. See ya.